Hey, yo, what's up, guys? I got my good friend on, Henry, again. We're going to talk about Gramsci, our favorite Italian Marxist philosopher. You want to introduce yourself, Henry?
Hello, name's Henry. I Marxist, interested in particular Gramsci, I guess, recently, and I do some writing as well, from a Marxist perspective on Substack.
Yeah,
And then we're working on the YouTube channel, but
your articles are good. You're a very knowledgeable guy. How did we meet again? I kind of forget. Uh,
I think I DM'd you about coming on the podcast, but it might have been something else.
Might have been something else. Honestly, most of our relationship is sort of just like sucking each other off. I'm not gonna lie. Like, you're so smart, Henry, and then you're like, you're so smart, Preet, and then it's a good
Mhm.
relationship. I feel like, yeah.
Ah,
It
okay. Great introduction to this very intellectual podcast, by the way.
Uh, Gramsci, he was an Italian Marxist. He was half Albanian. Do you want to talk a little bit, like, give a little bit of introduction to people?
Yeah, so I think one of the main reasons why this is a good topic is because there are so many different interpretations of Gramsci, both within the Marxist tradition and somewhat, I think, dangerously outside of it. And there is a there are a lot of what I think you could definitely consider bastardizations of Gramsci, like Richard Wolff in some interview a while ago mentioned that, it kind of verges well at cocktail parties. If you mention Gramsci, it's sort of this nice intellectual figure you can talk about. But as soon as you mention that he was a revolutionary communist, people sort of get deflated. They like this idea of a, Italian brilliant intellectual who, saw things in such an interesting way, but they really remove him from what he saw as his life's project, which was a communist revolution. And so it seems very pertinent to have a marked, and at the same time, there haven't really been a lot of recent Marxist attempts to reclaim Gramsci in that way. There's a lot of like academic, dismissals of like the post-colonial theorists, interpretations of Gramsci and so on, but not as much of an attempt to like reclaim him, with the exception of some stuff Jacobin magazine has done and some other things like that. But it seemed like a good idea to really ground his thought in a Marxist-Leninist, revolutionary Marxist framework, which ultimately he came out of.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gramsci did something amazing, and it was that he noticed a lot of issues with the Marxist movement and especially Marxist dialectics. And it was that a lot of times it fell into positivism or epiphenomenalism, like this idea that just because it was called catastrophe theory, basically pushed by Kautsky, that this idea that just because capitalism has these economic laws and that capitalism degrades, revolution will happen automatically, right? So it sort
Mm.
of was a trend that ignored the human aspect of the superstructure. And so Gramsci's bread and butter was looking at the superstructure less mechanically and more accurately, less like completely based on the base and more humanistically. But what happened was a lot of people took his ideas, especially bourgeois people, liberals, intellectuals, and they completely eliminated the class struggle from Gramsci, which was always important to him.
Mhm.
They completely eliminated Leninism from Gramsci. I mean, he was a committed Leninist, and so
Mhm.
Gramsci has sort of been turned into a harmless Hollywood figure. I mean, in a
Mhm.
lot of ways. Actually, the last time I saw Gramsci in a Hollywood film was Guillermo's Pinocchio movie. He was in the background. So, and
Oh yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I'm pretty sure Guillermo is a Marxist though.
yeah. He is radical. He is radical. But like Gramsci, when you'll see him. brought up, it's usually by liberals, by, people who don't wanna and people
Mhm.
who bastardize his thought. They turn him into, like, an idealist, right? Instead
Yeah.
of, eh, a a part of it was, like, Gramsci's ideas led to, critical theory, and critical theory, it has some good aspects to it, but critical theory rejected the class struggle completely. It focused completely
Yeah.
on, stuff in the superstructure, and that does a disservice to Gramsci's work, I feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you could also, go as far as to say that became a form of bourgeois ideology. I think there also and also it's provoked a reaction on the part, of, certain factions of the left, who see Gramsci as just that, and don't really go, don't really try to discern what his real convictions were, and that really robs the left of all of his insights. And of course, there are critiques of him like everyone else, but I think that's another pernicious aspect of him being co-opted.
Yeah, exactly, and I think his concepts of hegemony, of consent, could be very organic intellectuals, which we'll get into later. I mean, these could all, aid revolutionary movements so much, especially in the West. They could aid revolutionary movements combined with the class struggle. But a lot of Marxists and Marxist-Leninists and Marxist-Leninist Maoists are afraid to engage with these ideas because they perceive Gramsci as sort of a bourgeois ideology or bastardized. They've only confronted Gramsci as he's been interpreted by liberals who have sort of
Mhm.
bastardized his thought. So like, getting into it, I'll just give a brief biography of Gramsci. Do you wanna add anything for his biography?
Not really.
Okay.
I think if anything comes to mind, I'll mention it.
Yeah, sure. I got a handle then. So Gramsci was born in 1891 in Sardinia, Italy. And he was like a very, very sick child. He had a hunched back. He suffered from poor health for his entire life. Um, and so a lot of his writings were done in great pain. And I think a little bit of that sort of bleeds into his outlook. I mean, of course, a biography, completely individualizing his theories are would be wrong, but I think part of his life experience, especially experiencing that, did bleed into it. He would be a foundational member of the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, which split up from the PSI, which was the Italian Socialist Party. However, he would often clash with PCI's leader, Bordiga, especially over Bordiga's views of fascism and creating a united front with the PSI, which Lenin and the Comintern kept on telling PCI to do over and over and over again, and they refused. It's because Bordiga didn't really see fascism as that big of a threat. Though, to give some credit to Bordiga, he did have an all right ish analysis of fascism, but he didn't see it as big of a threat as Gramsci saw it, or as Lenin and the Comintern saw it. He would be arrested in 1926 by Mussolini, and the ruling judge would proclaim, "For 20 years, we must stop his brain from functioning in that trial." He would die in 1937. And while in prison, he would write his famous prison notebooks. And his prison was torturous. His time in prison was torturous. I mean, he's suffering from all these health problems. He's being denied medical attention. But he worked through it and he wrote almost like 3,000 pages of his prison notebooks. And yeah, that's
Yeah.
his life story.
If for the best English translation is just from Columbia University Press. They have the first 8 prison notebooks, which is really the only chunk that's worth reading, in 3 volumes, so highly recommend it. There's also a lot of great notes on the text within it. If you get the chance, I think, you can order it online, and also you can find it for free on, Marxist.org, I believe. One thing that's kind of funny, though, I wanted to mention is I always thought, like, why didn't they just kill him? You know what I mean? Like, especially the judge saying, like, "We must stop his brain from function." It's like, weren't they just allowed to kill whoever, they didn't like? It's kinda
No, no,
always
no.
struck me as funny, like it's a half measure. Um,
I feel like
but
even
yeah.
the most evil regimes in history have to maintain, like, an illusion of civil society,
Yeah.
like, in the 1930s, right before the Nazis really started doing the Holocaust, they would have, like, Jewish authors that were, like, mostly Zionists actually, write, like, articles saying, like, "Oh, the anti-Semitism isn't that bad. Oh, the Nuremberg laws aren't that bad. You guys are freaking out." Like, they always
Mhm.
sort of have to maintain that illusion, they can't just,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah, it was interesting.
unless you're big bad Stalin, and then you can just kill more bajillion people, just like
Yeah, with the spoon. With the spoon.
with a spoon.
But yeah, he struggled with medical challenges his whole life, and he was a really brilliant guy. I think he writes about all kinds of things that aren't really explicitly Marxist. He had, really fascinating, interpretations of Machiavelli, of all kinds of, uh, ideas and figures within the Italian intellectual tradition and Italian folklore. He engaged very seriously with things like Fordism, and Henry Ford's model of production, and
Mhm.
was really just a brilliant intellectual figure. And I think uh, part of what makes him such a brilliant analyst of the superstructure is that he was he seems to have been very insecure about what the Communist Party of Italy would have thought of his writings, because he was fundamentally rejecting Marx's idea that the base is a deterministic, driver of history and of the superstructure and culture and politics and society, and that all of this is a very simple deterministic relationship. And you could say that he did still think that the base was deterministic, but he thought that it was much, much more complicated than Marxists had given it credit for. And um, but then at the same time, he was a staunch materialist. So he doesn't really get into a lot of the quagmire that people like Frederick Jameson or, Marxists who are just interested in the superstructure and culture and artistic analysis, where they're really generating output that is interesting intellectually, but not really helpful in terms of class struggle at all. But Gramsci, in everything that he did, he was largely trying to understand culture and hegemony and all of that in order to better build proletarian movement. Um, and there's a couple of things that make understanding Gramsci's writing a bit complicated. The primary one is that the later Gramsci, or after he was locked in prison, when he wrote most of his work, although a lot of what he wrote before that is really interesting too. But when he was in prison, he had to write using kind of code, um, and because the fascists would read all of his writing and they would see if you're talking about class or you're talking about, this or that. So he would have to use certain code words. And that has resulted in a lot of his writing being a little bit difficult to understand because he uses substitute words. Um, and he also engages in writing about all kinds of other things that interested him in addition to Marxism because of this specter of his work constantly being censored. And if it seemed too Marxist, it would get thrown out. But it also had the interesting effect of making him very creative, and coming up with all kinds of new Marxist ideas, because he, one, was trying to understand culture, and two was, and the superstructure, and two, he had to get around all of these challenges. So although his story is really impressive because of how resilient he was, a lot of the things that constrained him, like his health and the censorship, really kind of arguably made him such a creative thinker, and also somewhat challenging to understand. So um, and then I guess we were going to start with discussing his idea of organic and traditional intellectuals. And that really forms the basis of a lot of his other relevant ideas. when it comes to topics like hegemony and the subaltern and so on.
Yeah, I think I can sort of give a little bit of context of also Europe that he was thinking in, because Gramsci, I think this would help the viewers a lot. Gramsci was thinking in a Europe that had just experienced the Bolshevik Revolution, and a lot of his writing is trying to figure out why that revolution didn't happen in Western Europe, right? And
Mhm.
I think he figured out a really great formula where even a lot of modern day Marxists, they'll fall into like a complete reliance on the base, the economic motivations of society, which is the labor aristocracy theory. But Gramsci was able to look at cultural aspects within the superstructure that also kept revolution from happening within Western Europe, especially within Italy, which had a very uneven sort of bourgeois revolution and unification. Right? So, like, the bourgeoisie hadn't completely won in Italy. It had relied on, sort of a broad class alliance between various peasant elements, and so, there were still a lot of contradictions within Italy that, Gramsci was talking in. And then finally, the socialist movement in Western Europe, especially led by Kautsky and the Second International, subscribed to catastrophe theory, and it was a completely mechanical materialist sort of take where it's like, oh, if the economy goes bad and capitalism develops, we automatically get revolution. Like, and I mean, I'm sure there's Kotsky fans that are going to be in the comments like, that's not his theory completely, but it was basically that. Like, it was a complete reliance on the basis society.
Determinism.
Yeah,
Mhm.
determinism. And Gramsci added a lot more nuance to that, and I think he's been proven a little bit right by history, like more than right by the subsequent development of history, especially against determinism, and positivism and epiphenomenalism. Like these ideas that just because the economy or the economic modes of production and the economic basis of society is doing bad, we automatically get development within the superstructure, or it's a one to one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I think something that did occur to me too, though, is it is difficult to tell whether or not he was actually a determinist, but at the very least, he thought that the relationship was not nearly as simple as Marxists like Kautsky thought. It wasn't just like this linear progression, from feudalism to capitalism to communism, and that this was a, step by step process. And, that was, really easy to understand. It's possible that he might have thought that this was inevitable, but the way that it transpired would be, very different and much more complex than this kind of simple evolution. And, Marx's kind of view of the workers sort of just going into the factory and deciding to take it, that it would be this very complex struggle that's very multifaceted. And it, because of that, um, the proletariat needed to understand a lot of these uh, conflicts that emerge within the sphere of the superstructure as well.
Yeah, yeah, because I think Marx and Engels were especially writing in a time of Darwinism and evolutionary theory, and
Mhm.
they had a very sort of I Gramsci took a Marxist dialectics and he really expanded and complexified it because it was very simple and almost evolutionary. And a lot of early evolution also fell into determinism before we got like more, just like how the science of biology has had to expand past our more simple conceptions of early evolution. Like we don't use the phrase for survival of the fittest anymore. Gramsci also sort of evolved the Marxist science past those little more simplistic ideas where Marx sort of just thought that the workers of Europe would it would be a gradual sort of like clear cut evolution. Gramsci recognized that it was a little bit more messy, especially in the superstructure. Yeah. So, do you want to do traditional intellectuals or should I?
Um, I'm down to let you start and chip in.
Okay, sure. So for Gramsci, traditional intellectuals were intellectuals that appear independent from class, though they do reinforce it without realizing it. So this can be your clergy, your professors and academics, your intellectuals. But organic intellectuals are those that arise with a class and represent its interests. This can be the ruling class or the ruled classes, but you can sort of think of a union organizer. He's arisen with the proletariat class. He goes down to the factory and he talks to the workers about how they need to organize. Or Lenin, this great theorist who rose with the growing working class of Russia and the world, and he really formulated a lot of ideas they needed in the imperialist age. But another example of an organic intellectual could be like a right wing talk show host, like Ben Shapiro. He represents the organic ideas of the bourgeoisie, and he disseminates it to the masses. There's this
Yeah,
really great. Oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say, one of the ways he identifies how you can really notice an organic intellectual is when they make references to common sense. So you especially hear conservatives and reactionaries say this, but or the Trumpian reactionary movement. Oh, this is common sense. It's a given. This is the way the world is. And then on the flip side, you could also have a worker who's, this is the rich get richer, they exploit us, this is just common sense, it's sort of something that comes from the reality in which you live and what kind of immediately makes sense to you, like as an explanation for things. And it just kind of exists in every social group and class, based on what their material conditions are.
Yeah, the common sense, the way Gramsci described it, is sort of this. It's not actually common sense, like in a way, but
Yeah.
it's just these ideas based around your class that have been disseminated to you that seem natural because of the way that they've
Mhm.
been disseminated. And a lot of people are under bourgeois common sense, right? So it's like, oh, we can't go past Democrats or Republicans, or we can't go past capitalism. To them, common sense is the ruler's ideas, the bourgeois. But I've never heard of a worker's common sense being
Well,
created.
his view of like organic intellectuals is that it's a very broad concept.
Ah.
So it can be, it exists within the bourgeois. There's organic intellectuals of the bourgeois, but there can also be organic intellectuals of the working class. And I mean, even if you, um, but it's just an analysis of, you know, what are my material conditions? What is my, it arises naturally, like organically out of like out of a, set of material circumstances. Um, and it can be a bourgeois organic intellectualism or a proletarian one, or, it can be because of like a group of people in voluntary isolation, like in places like Brazil and the Amazon, like, they have their own experience and their own common sense and their own view of things, just like, every social group is going to have um, their own set of like givens. And if you're, in West Virginia, and a minor, like you might not have class consciousness, but you might, talk amongst yourself and say, oh yeah, well, obviously the bosses are screwing us over. This is, of course, this is the way it is. But it's that kind of, when he says organic, he means it kind of just comes as a result of people observing their material circumstances. And when the bourgeoisie engages in that analysis, it turns into hegemonic intellectualism because, unlike the proletariat, the bourgeoisie has power, it has control over institutions and media and the news. And so the organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie have a huge amount of influence. And that becomes the hegemonic culture. But it's the same kind of urge of like, well, what makes sense to me, I guess. And so that, that's how he saw it. And like, that's like the fundamental unit and how he connected people's material conditions to culture and ideas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so basically, the difference between an organic intellectual and a traditional intellectual is that traditional intellectuals are commonly not seen as political, and their roles typically do reinforce the superstructure. Like, for example, your university math professor or like economics professor, even like they may present themselves as apolitical, but they do very often reinforce the ideas of the ruling class or society. Journalists, journalists. I mean, all these guys are typically um, s- promoted as non-political, apolitical. I mean, I think liberal society especially loves this illusion of the apolitical career,
Mhm.
right? Like an apolitical journalist or an apolitical newspaper, right? We're not neither left nor right, but
Yeah.
they all do essentially reinforce the ideas. But
Yeah, like Asmongold, like the political streamer, he always like, "Oh, I'm not political," but he obviously just loves Trump.
he he's also like pseudo fascist, like in a lot of ways.
Yeah, like, yeah.
um,
But according to him, not political.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's like gamer culture too, right? Like a lot of these gamer guys are sort of traditional. I mean, I hate to say it, but they are because like they'll act like they're not political, but a lot of the times they'll like
Yeah,
make
and
this audience
we are
of
lacking in. I mean, there's such a strong
they'll make this
culture of
audience of like young
creating,
impressionable men
community
um
of color.
uh uh they'll make this audience of young impressionable men go towards right-wing culture, right-wing Nazi culture.
Mhm.
Like it's insane. Like I don't know. It's
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You go from Halo to Hitler, like I don't
Yeah.
uh to Gramsci, we needed like organic intellectuals for the working class to spread ideas, create like cross-class alliances. It's not like an alliance between the proletariat and like the petty bourgeoisie. It was mostly between the proletariat and the peasantry. And Gramsci's model for spreading working class thought was through workers' councils, which had popped up in Turin, especially. And they've been really successful ways for him to disseminate sort of uh, working class ideas amongst the working class, sort of teach them, get them class conscious, things like that. Do you have anything on the workers' councils?
Yeah, he did, he was so I mean, this is another, like, evolution in his thinking, but he originally was a kind of a left communist, like an Italian left communist, and was a syndicalist. So he emphasized workers' councils and really syndicalist ideas. But then he went to the Soviet Union for 2 years, and became extremely influenced by Lenin and by the Soviet Union to the point where he outwardly advocated, for Italy to basically be part of the Soviet Union. And so that was a major transformation in his thinking, where he saw the Soviet Union and the way that operated, and became very influenced by Lenin's thinking. But he originally started with more of a syndicalist view, and this was more common at that time in Italy because there was a real concern amongst the leftists in Italy that they would lose touch with the working class, that they would, that they really needed to maintain the roots that they had in the, peasant culture of Italy, in the Po River Valley kind of farming, laboring, sections of the society. And partially, for a lot of reasons, because Italy is so pluralistic, at the time it was, still, even today, the regions are so different in Italy. And then it was even more significant, so there was an anxiety about like, we need to make sure we really stay close to the working class. And this should all be in terms of the workers' direction and all of this. But he moved away from that after visiting the Soviet Union, became a much more staunch Leninist, and an advocate of the Soviet model, basically.
For sure, for sure. I think a lot of his ideas are sort of based in the fact that, like, once again, Italy did not have a full bourgeois revolution, and so the people who united Italy, they had to make cross-class alliances in order to not
Mhm,
really fundamentally upturn Italian class rule, especially feudal peasant rule,
mhm,
especially between the industrial north and the more peasant south, and that's where he got a lot of his. I think Gramsci's his ideas are universal, but they're so tied to the specific context of what Italy was in the early 1900s,
mhm.
especially the developing society. Oh, also workers' councils are a great way to teach people. I mean, I'm not denying that.
Mhm.
But and nowadays, I think Gramsci's ideas of the organic intellectual, he would have loved the internet, like, as a way to
Yeah.
disseminate these ideas. Like, he would have absolutely saw the internet as a amazing framework so many people I know would not be communists if it was not for the internet. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's undeniable.
I think that would be a good way to end the conversation um, at the end of the podcast because you could really connect it to a lot of ongoing discussions, especially about the so-called left wing and right wing pipelines, and how if that is a thing that exists, and how it relates to Gramsci's understanding. And yeah, I think it's also an inspiring reminder, and he also I think was very against idolizing past figures and very much a proponent of just analyzing the current circumstances and of one's own country. And so it's also very inspiring to see his intellect applied to the situation in Italy at the time, because we really need to be doing that here. And starting with the internet seems to be a pretty logical connection.
Yeah, I mean, the internet is such an important tool in our modern day age. I don't think it can be ignored. And there's a lot of socialist parties and communist parties that are so boomerfied, right? Like they're still stuck with like newspapers. Their online
Mhm.
presence is ugly and their websites are ugly. And it's like, we got to get the left into the modern age and polished, I think, to some extent, especially since the right has so much funding and has been able to do so.
Mhm.
Um, so Gramsci, he took Marx's conception of the base and the superstructure, which I can give a little brief introduction. So Marx saw the economic base of society, that is the productive forces, so the level of technological development and the relations of production, which is how that technological development is distributed and run according to class. So, are you a feudal society and you're doing agriculture? Are you doing industrial society and capitalism? Are you, a slave society and doing, I don't know, slave work and farming still, things like that. That he saw the economic basis society as the main crux of society. It was the main starting off point for everything else in society, the being the superstructure. And the superstructure was government, education, media. That's all originates from the base. But Marx's conception of that base and superstructure, it was a little bit simplistic. It was a little bit that the base, the economic base, and the superstructure are one to one. So, like if we have a class relation within capitalism of proletariat and bourgeois, it's like a one to one reflection, even in the ideologies of people within the superstructure. Um,
Mhm.
and so this led to a little bit of determinism. This led to a little bit of epiphenomenalism, positivism, just like completely relying on the base. Um, Especially catastrophe theory, which we mentioned, it was a completely mechanical interpretation of Marxism that revolution and class consciousness were just inevitable, because the structure of society reflected the base completely. And Gramsci added like much needed nuance to it through expanding how the superstructure operated. He divided the superstructure into civil society and the state. And so the state was the repressive apparatus of society, police, army, things like that. But civil society was something that Henry, could you give a little bit of description of civil society?
Yeah, so really he looked at the distinctions because the central question was, why did the revolution occur in Russia and not Germany? And so in one way you could think of civil society as the as a one of the differences between Russia and Germany at the time. And the state in Russia was actually very, very strong under Nicholas, and was very capable of repression and violence. But Gramsci believed that this reliance on repression and violence and force, and this kind of what are you going to do about it? We're the ones in charge mentality is what made the revolution, is what sowed the seeds for the 1905 and, later, of course, 1917 revolution in Russia. Whereas in a place like Germany or Italy or France or England, where capitalism was more developed, there's a development of all kinds of institutions. And these institutions are associated with certain ideals, certain ideas, and the views of what is good and what is bad, what is desirable, um, become changed as the society becomes more proletarian. So one example of that would be the court system, right? So the view of equality under the law, and anyone, whoever you are, you come in front of the courts, you're equal. It implies that there's some sort of commitment on the part of the whole society, for the benefit of everyone, to an ideal of justice that is upheld. And that gives people a lot more faith in institutions. It makes them less likely to say, well, we should just, off with their heads, kind of, I have nothing to lose, because there is more of a actual sense of value that's, upheld in these institutions. Another one is things like the bureaucracy of the state, the news, all kinds of industrialization and innovations that made people feel like, things are changing, things are getting better. Um, and, a whole gamut of things that make it more difficult to form revolutionary consciousness and revolutionary movements without uh, developing what Gramsci called counter hegemony, which is where the subaltern, or the proletarian classes develop their own parallel institutions and their own ideas about how the world works, in order to galvanize the class struggle. And an interesting example of this, I think, and it's an independent example that has nothing to do with Gramsci, but it was actually, I think, some of the impressions that the British had of Gandhi, where, when he left South Africa, there was one British official who was reported to have said, finally this like demon is gone, you know. And a lot of Gandhi's view was that the British know how to deal with someone with a gun, right? They know how to deal with this violent revolutionary. They just throw more guns, they throw more soldiers at them. But if I preach nonviolence and non-cooperation, well, they really won't know what to do with me. It'll drive them crazy, and it will lead to inspiring tons of other people. And Gandhi, obviously not a Marxist figure, by any stretch of the imagination at all, but that's an example of how, that sort of thing that Gramsci thought was important. Not nonviolence, but this idea of not copying the ruling class's methods and hegemony, but building your own values and your own parallel institutions, which can form the basis of a, revolutionary identity, of a counter hegemonic identity, which stymies the methods that the ruling class uses to dominate culture. Um, and where in Russia, where there was no cultural hegemony really on the part of the bourgeoisie, this was much easier. Um, to do, so, Lenin distributed all these pamphlets and was very inspirational. There were all these other communist movements, and there were there wasn't really a whole lot of um, counter narrative on the part of the state, other than, well, this would be scary, or this would be bad, or this would be a collapse in society. But they had very weak arguments. Whereas, take the United States today, the Heritage Foundation, Hillsdale College, they'll give you tons of intellectual stooges that will give you all this nonsense about communism and how it's basically fascism, and all the, there's a ton of effort put into um, confusing people, giving them stupid ideas, propping up figures who um, are in service of the dominant hegemonic group. Um, and to counter that, you need these alternative ideas, this proletarian view of the world. Um, and actually, an interesting example of that happening in the United States is under Huey Long in Louisiana. Huey Long was like kind of a communist. It was killed by FDR, if you don't know, but he created all kinds of civil society, like workers' organizations in Louisiana that are still there today, these parallel institutions, which I think is really valuable because it's something that can keep society going that is not connected to the hegemony of capitalist society. So it's a bit long, but I think that's that's really important to understand why Gramsci was so interested in hegemony and counter hegemony in civil society
Yeah, yeah.
because yeah.
Yeah. I'm just gonna butt in super quick. I was having a little bit of trouble describing civil society, but basically Gramsci's great realization was the underdeveloped capitalist states of Russia, they could only rely on the state and state repression in order to keep their power. And so that's like police, army, what have you. But the Western European countries with like a lot more highly developed capitalism, such as America, they had so much many other institutions of sort of ideological control to get consent from the masses, media, universities, newspapers, movies, I don't know, just like even some limited like civil liberties. And these allowed them to keep the masses under them without having to rely and get consent from the masses to rule them without having to rely purely on complete 24/7 repression. And it's a really good way of understanding why revolution failed to some extent in Western Europe when it succeeded in Eastern Europe. It gives a little bit more. It lies less on economic determinism. It gives a little bit more power to human beings as makers of history, because Gramsci said that we could also create counter hegemonies to the ruling hegemony, right? This ruling idea, and of course, there's the undeniable fact that no revolution, like especially bourgeois revolution, has happened with just the bourgeoisie. Right. In the American Revolution, they needed the workers of America to fight their war. And so, in order to do that, they had to give up some civil liberties. They had to give up a little bit of civil society to the workers of America in order to get the American Revolution to happen. Otherwise, workers wouldn't have fought for George Washington and their bourgeois interests, right? So they created a civil society and civil liberties, the ideas of liberty, justice for all, whatever that bullshit is that we say in the Pledge of Allegiance. You can go ahead if you want to finish, Henry.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry for going on for so long, but it's really connected to all kinds of concepts within the way that Gramsci viewed the world. And yeah, it really has to do with upholding these kinds of ideas, confusing people. I mean, and you hear it all the time in terms of ideas people have about communism. Like starvation and whatever. All of these are the product of uh, capitalist hegemony in dominating the narrative about these sorts of things. And Gramsci thought it was very important to counter that, um, and not just rely on this mistaken idea that the workers will just somehow understand their interests, collect, and the fact that they have to organize collectively, which I think is a key point. It's not just that it's not that workers don't understand their interests. It's that the value in collective action needs to become apparent.
Yeah, yeah. I think two very good examples of how the bourgeoisie use consent are like Turning Point USA or like PragerU. Like these are paid institutions that just disseminate their ideas across YouTube. Like every single ad on YouTube, even the slightest political thing has their ads on them. And, I think a lot of us watch that and we're like, who the fuck falls for this? But a lot of people do. I mean, I think a lot of people get stuck because, like, it does speak to a lot of the so-called common sense that we're taught in America.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is a bit corny to say like, "Oh, they don't want us to be educated," and that's why that it sort of is like a little corny to me for some reason, but there is a lot of truth to that because if you have discernment about sourcing, like who's making this, what motivations do they have, a lot of this becomes pretty apparent. So there are also lots of just like standard, you know, n- understand sources kinds of information that can make a big difference, when it comes to how gullible people are to that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so Gramsci's big idea, like if you ask anybody anything about Gramsci, it's always hegemony. Hegemony, hegemony, hegemony. His big idea was the hegemony. This was an idea he got from Lenin, though Lenin's conception was different. And he was able to discover it mostly through the fact that, again, like I was saying, Italy's revolution had been uneven. The revolutionaries of Italy, in order to unify Italy, had to rely on cross class alliances, especially with the peasant classes. And so, to Gramsci, hegemony was a way in which the ruling class of society exercises political, intellectual, and moral leadership through disseminating these ideas, right? This common sense over their subjects, mostly through civil society, right? So, right now, so many Americans are sort of in bourgeois hegemony. I mean, inevitably, you turn on Fox News, you turn on CNN, and you're bombarded 24/7 with uh, what the rich want you to think, essentially. I mean, Washington Post, whatever. And it just sort of becomes common sense for Americans to be unable to think. It seems unnatural. Like capitalism seems natural to most Americans as, physics, right? Or the Democratic Republican binary seems as natural as Newton's laws of gravity, right? Like it's impossible to think outside of it. And that's why it's so important for us to create a counter hegemony to oppose the dominant ruling class's hegemony, right? The dominant ruling class's transference of what we consider common sense. We need a proletarian common sense.
Yeah, and it's tricky because usually the environments where people talk about this sort of thing and really unwind it are elite university environments. Because if you're someone that's interested in the truth and thinking critically, you will stumble into this kind of understanding of the way that capitalist society reinforces itself. But even self-proclaimed Marxists in those environments have class interests which are antagonistic and antithetical to the interests of the working class. And so if that kind of thing is only really discussed in universities, hegemony, the way capitalists spread disinformation essentially, um, then you won't really see anything happen because these people won't do anything. They have a career path in the university. They have class interests which go against the working class, and so it's really important to disseminate these ideas into working class people because not only will it become apparent to them because they're the subjects of um, hegemony, cultural hegemony more than anyone else because they're the ones who need to be told, how the world is because they tend to be, more frustrated and want to figure out how they're getting screwed over because they know that they are on some level. And then when they do kind of understand or begin to have this, understanding of the world, their class interests will align with organization, will align with counter hegemony, and so on. So it's a very, I think, powerful and important concept that needs to be discussed outside the universities, which is unfortunately where it is today.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, a lot of like people, like I talk to rednecks all the time. I live in a rural area. They do have like a common sense that is a working class common sense, but they always just miss the mark, right? They get so close
Mm,
to it. They're like, yeah, I'm getting fucking screwed by my boss. I fucking hate working at the oil rig. I fucking hate blah blah blah. And then you're like, oh, oh,
yeah.
oh, like he's almost a communist. He's almost a communist. And then right at
Mm.
the very last turn, he's like, and it's the fucking Mexicans or like it's the fuck trans. And it's that's
Yeah.
that's where the bourgeois hegemony I think really gets them. Like they're or a lot of these blue collar guys they'll like make fun of baristas or something, right? Like this
proletarian war where like I'm a valid worker and you are a valid worker. And that really
Mhm.
repeats like that doesn't repeat the best interest of the working class. That's the best interest of the bourgeoisie. He's like sort of subsumed bourgeois ideology meant to divide the working class and began to think of himself as somewhat even bourgeois, like their interests are my interests, and fuck these striking Starbucks workers. When you're saying like fuck these Starbucks workers, you're not acting for yourself. You're acting for Howard Schultz or whoever the CEO of Starbucks is. I don't know. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's really easy to undermine solidarity, and I think it's especially pernicious, and it's one of the reasons why reactionary movements are so pernicious is because they always get very close to the truth and then just shy away from it, like the elites are screwing you over and it's because they're globalists and they hate America. And so intuitively people say, yeah, 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 that's what I've been noticing, that must be it. But then, they just pile on a bunch of nonsense in there. So you really have to expect a lot of people sometimes to like pick up on those nuances and the subtleties, but I don't think it's beyond people's ability by any stretch of the imagination to do that. Just the ideas need to get out there.
yeah. For Gramsci, there were groups that were within the hegemony, and then there were groups that were not within the hegemony. And any groups that were not within the hegemony were repressed by the state. So you can sort of think of, like, for example, the American Revolution. The American Revolution happens. The George Washington mostly needed white men in order to make up his army. Though there were black people and Native Americans, indigenous people, things like that. But he really needed the consent of the white working class. And so anybody outside of that, white, cis, I don't know, landowner, working class that helped him win the revolution, they were not within the hegemony, right? And so immediately, Native Americans, slaves, women, they got repressed by the state, police, army, um, and things like that. Even to some extent, like workers' uprisings got repressed by the state when they broke the hegemony. For example, like Bacon's rebellion or Shays' rebellion, things like that. Um, do you want to touch on subaltern groups?
Yeah, so Gramsci's understanding of what subaltern means is actually sort of the subject of considerable debate. Some people argue that he just meant basically peasants or anyone that was outside of capitalist society, not even inclusive of workers. And to others, this is just anyone marginalized at all. So that in particular became a common interpretation amongst what became known as the subaltern studies group, which was a group of post-colonial theorists that really expanded this term to mean, anything, in any hierarchy, any kind of marginalization, there's a subaltern group and a dominant group. And this was used by many of these scholars to detract from the centrality of class, and class became just another axis of marginalization and not a critical one. So it's sort of descended into a variant of liberalism, in my opinion, because the whole reason that class struggle is central in Marxism isn't that classism, quote unquote, if there is such a thing, is like the worst oppression people experience. It has nothing to do with who's most oppressed. It's that this is the group of people best suited to provoke social change in society since they occupy such a strategic position, and they are not hegemonic, and they produce all the value in society. So um, it's not about any marginalized group being less important. It's that this is the axis with which gains for all marginalized groups can be realized, and you have to be diligent about keeping that sort of thing in mind, that this is the goal behind class struggle, but um, it's not um, it's not this liberal interpretation of oppression and so on and so forth. So I think it's very clear that Gramsci meant by subaltern peasants and workers. I think he probably just meant peasants and workers. Um, and in a similar way to how Lenin talked about the proletarian peasantry. Um, but he also talked about the subaltern as anyone subjected to bourgeois cultural hegemony. Anyone whose common sense, whose reality was not was denied by the prevailing views and culture of the society, which was dominated by the bourgeoisie. And there it becomes, you can see how they expanded it and how they latched on to that view of it. Um, but in general, the subaltern person on Gramsci's view is supposed to be the center of counter hegemony and of creating, alternative way of looking at the world, alternative institutions, alternative art and cultural ideas which are subversive and can ultimately be used to go against capitalism.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with like some aspects of critical, for example, like critical theory, which took this concept and like, like took it and applied it to like races and like sexes and like gender and things like that. But where they sort of lose where they sort of lose what Gramsci's original radical thought was when they completely deny class struggle, right? Like when they completely turn it into a sort of cultural struggle between like and you were exactly right on the head. It's like how liberals conceptualize oppression or like all of these identities completely unrelated to class. It's just the identity existing by itself in a vacuum, and we can sort of just overcome the issues of minorities in America just through like electing Obama or something, or like fighting through some sort of cultural struggle against racism without ever addressing the class capitalist aspects of racism that drive racism so much. I mean, minorities in this country substantially are economically affected worse than whites in almost every single measurable way, and that's never wanted to be tackled. Somebody in my comment section said something along the lines of base reductionism, so like completely relying on the base of society is revisionist, and superstructure reductionism is completely revisionist. Like completely relying on this cultural superstructural thing and denying class struggle. That's they're both forms of revisionism, and they get away
Mm.
from Gramsci's radical thought, which was yes, focus on the superstructure, focus on the class struggle. That I mean, the cultural struggle, but that has to be tied with the class struggle and this subaltern idea. It cannot be, yeah, you can use it for indigenous people within America, for minorities in America. That's great. Women struggles, gay struggles, but it also has to be fundamentally tied with the idea of the proletariat, with class revolution.
Yeah, and well, it just displays like almost no understanding, of Marxism, because the idea that Marxists care about something called classism, like there's all these microaggressions being made about, people's like class that's like oppressing them. And that's what Marxists care about. I mean, it's so childish and ridiculous. Like it's difficult to even take it seriously in the first place. And the view is that class is central because it's a vehicle. Class struggle is a way to have progressive social change for anything. It's a mechanism to actually achieve that. And you have to keep, you know, marginalized groups in account because that's the whole point. But the operation with which you can actually bring about that change is not um, in liberal society where it's dominated by the interests of capitalists. It is in a through a class struggle where you live in an egalitarian society, and then you actually have some sort of ability to speak objectively about oppression and marginalization and, what have you. So it's not that these things are secondary. It's that, secondary in terms of badness, because that's what liberals do is they think about it in terms of who's the most oppressed, who experiences the worst marginalization. And that really isn't the interesting thing. The important thing, is how do you make change in society? And that's through class struggle and the working class. Not that the working class is the most marginalized group. That's not the point.
Yeah, yeah, because the most marginalized group in Gramsci's time or Lenin's time was the peasantry, right? So, but
Mhm.
they still, their big focus was still on the proletariat. Um,
Mhm.
and it's we don't view the proletariat as like something that's specially oppressed. It's just scientifically, it's without moral character. I feel like, and a lot of times these oh my god, I hate to use this term, but the oppression Olympics, like, I don't wanna say it, but a lot of times the liberals will fall into these oppression Olympics where they don't want to, view the proletariat scientifically, instead just want to focus on, like, I don't know, like, Kamala's a black Indian woman, and you cannot criticize anything about her, or, like, and it just falls into, just superstructure revisionism, like, complete focusing on the superstructure, no class analysis, and it robs even the people that they claim they're trying to help out, because how does Kamala help out? How does a bourgeois ruler fundamentally help out groups that are oppressed by capitalism? And
Yeah.
it they're going to remain oppressed. They're going to remain having, like, black Americans were not going to be helped out by Kamala getting into the highest office in the land if she was going to continue capitalism. Like, it didn't make
Yeah.
any sense. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
no, go ahead.
There's a really great book on post-colonial theory in particular and this problem called Post-Colonial Theory and the Specter of Capital by Vivek Chipper. And I think he, is just very great and incisive on this point because it's also he notes that it's difficult to ignore the fact um, that a lot of the post-colonial theorists come from the bourgeoisie of global South nations. And so they are very appealing, in Western universities where their ideas are very fashionable because, this is the global South, views of the global South, whatever. And, you're some Western liberal and you want to feel like you're so woke or whatever. And, um, it also gives you a way to say, yeah, well, there's just so many complexities in all these different groups, and who knows what we should do, I guess I'll just sit here and write another book about this and, analyze art or something because we don't know what to do. It sort of allows for this seemingly radical but actually conservative view. And something else that he notes is that a lot of the subaltern studies school in particular was really interested in Orientalism. Like Edward Said's or conception of Orientalism, and this idea that Orientalism is a homogenizing view, that essentializes certain things in the so-called East as being kind of this way, identity is religious. There's, no, that there's a certain homogeneity, that there's this constellation of village communities, like all these Orientalist ideas. They said, um, you know, that, we need to take this back and give a voice to the subaltern, third world people to define their own identity and, reject these Orientalist views, which, I think we can all agree with. But then what Chipper really notes is that they end up recreating the same ideology of Orientalism, which essentializes the global South as a place where there is no class struggle, where there's no capitalism the way it exists in Europe, and as a place that is fundamentally different, has different laws of economics than Europe. And then you can just say Marx is just some, dead European white guy. who was just another European trying to essentialize the East, make universal categories, about the East. And so we can just kind of reject Marxism easily. So it's actually an interesting example in the context of Gramsci of bourgeois ideology being used to like defang Marxism. And another good example of how the universities really like destroy it.
That's even a problem within our left. I mean, I think the Western left fetishizes the global South. I mean, it's like the way they talk about the global South, it's almost like there's no class conflict in the global South. Everybody in the global
Yeah.
South is a proletariat and they're fighting against the West and they're all communist. And it's like, no, no, no. They have class contradiction in the global South. Like, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah.
They're subsumed within a bourgeois hegemony in the global South. There's plenty of people subsumed within the hegemony in the global South. And even a lot of people in the global South, and I don't think Western communists realize this, are subsumed within Western hegemony. Like they have
Mhm.
a fetishization of America. They see
Yeah.
America in movies and
Mhm.
in TV shows and in YouTube videos, and they think America is amazing and everything about America. Especially the middle
Mhm.
classes, the upper to middle classes, or the middle classes of the global South. Those
Mhm.
guys love America. Um,
Mhm.
I think like a group that exemplifies what Gramsci wanted to do and stays within his radical thought is the Black Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition. Like this coalition that had like the Yellow Peril and the Black Panthers, the Patriots, the Young Patriots. It c- it recognizes the contradictions of within the cultural struggle, but it still keeps it within a class struggle, and that's the framework
Mhm.
that we really need in America. I mean, we obviously, communists who say like, "Oh, black people's issues don't matter, only workers' issues matter." They're fundamentally missing out on the cultural struggle, the issues within the superstructure, intersectionality. But then also people who say like, "Oh, they completely rely on the superstructure and they fetishize the global South and they like say like, "Oh, Marx was a dead white man. Like, who cares about what he has to say?" They completely miss the economic base of society. And
Yeah.
I don't know, like post-colonial studies, they were based on Fanon's work. I mean, he was really a
Mhm.
foundational post-colonial theorist, and his ideas were inherently based in war. Like they were inherently based in violence. They were inherently based in an radical
Mhm.
upturning of society. And yet post-colonial studies within the West, even though they'll read Fanon, they don't
Mhm.
do that. They turn it into some stupid
Oh,
cultural
yeah.
observation. Like these post-colonial guys will write like 200 books about why Aladdin is Orientalist. And great, I mean, the movie Aladdin is Orientalist. I get that.
Yeah.
But
It's the most obvious observation ever.
I know, no. But like, why the fuck aren't you writing about why the Middle East needs revolution? Like why
Mhm.
Palestine needs to be liberated, or why I don't know, Egypt under the Sisi dictatorship
Mhm.
has issues or something like that. I don't know, something of that sort. Instead of
Mhm.
just I don't know, it just robs Fanon, it just robs Gramsci of their importance, and this has been done, I mean, time immemorial. I mean, even Lenin noticed that happening with Marx. I mean, I think if you have good ideas that will fundamentally change society, I think the bourgeois grab them and they scrub all your radicalism off of you.
Mhm.
As like a
Yeah,
social
totally.
mechanism, yeah.
And it's a good illustration of cultural hegemony too. But yeah, Fanon is definitely another figure similar to Gramsci where he would probably be just so mad at seeing the way people have interpreted him. I remember in my undergrad one of my undergrad courses we were reading Fanon, just like the basic like Wretched of the Earth, and the teacher, the professor was saying, well, we really want to think about like let's evaluate like his view on whether, violence is okay, like, in colonial Algeria. And I remember sitting there and thinking like, okay, I've lived in the Imperial Corps my whole life, by all accounts, like a privileged person within the Imperial Corps. But like, what do you mean you can't understand like why someone would be supportive of violence, against like all these atrocities that the French were committing. Like, what do you mean, you know? And it's sort of like it happens naturally because that reality is so alien. You know, if you haven't studied the history, the reality is so alien to bourgeois people that they can't really it becomes this intellectual exercise. Like it's not even like there's a sinister ploy to defang all these people. It happens because to that to because it's not they're trying to fit it within their own bounds of quote unquote common sense, and what value is there here, outside of all the nonsense about going against us, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a real difficult uphill thing.
I think also like figures like very radical figures like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King or whatever. They ignite like because these are organic intellectuals. They ignite a movement from the bottom up, like a counter hegemony, and the predominant hegemony, the bourgeois hegemony. It after these figures die, it has to recognize. It's forced to recognize this movement, this organic movement that they created from the
Mhm.
bottom up. And so in order to work with this movement, they'll admit that these guys were great. Oh yeah, we'll have like Martin Luther King Jr. Day and Rosa Parks. We'll have like we'll teach her in the classes and how great she was. But we're just gonna kill their ideas, right? Like
Mhm.
everything that they stood for, we're gonna turn them
Yeah,
into our figures, right? And
yeah.
that's a really smart way of getting at people's common sense, actually, because I mean, according to my common sense, if I'm like a worker and I'm a worker of color, I mean, I love Martin Luther King. And so now the state is telling me, yeah, 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 Martin Luther King was this great guy. And he wanted
Mhm,
me to support the current US government as it operates. Okay, great.
mhm.
So I'm a Republican and I love Martin Luther King. And now I love capitalism, right? Like, or something like that. Or
Yeah, yeah,
I love locking up people at the border because this is what Martin Luther King would have done because I don't know,
yeah,
Donald Trump tweets, "I love Martin
yeah,
Luther King" on
yeah,
even though he's probably, like, saying racial slurs the whole time he's tweeting it, like, on like, let's be
yeah,
honest, yeah, yeah.
yeah. It's yeah, it is tough, and it's but the other interesting thing, one of the interesting things Gramsci talks about is how this isn't actually this hopeless, domination by the bourgeoisie, because the fact that they have to do this shows how proletarian consciousness is actually something that's pretty natural. You didn't think it was inevitable, but it is actually something that comes pretty naturally to people. And there's this constant, whack-a-mole that the bourgeoisie has to do to maintain capitalism. And I think that should be, pretty encouraging as well. We sort of covered, I did want to cover the war of position and the war of movement. And then if we could talk about applying him to conversations about contemporary America and the internet and that kind of thing?
Yeah, of course. I'll just go over consent super quick.
Oh,
I
yeah,
just had
yeah.
one quote from him about consent. Gramsci said that consent is something that is, quote, given by the great masses of the population to the general direction imposed by social life by the dominant fundamental group. This consent is historically caused by the prestige which the dominant group enjoys because of its position and the function in world production, end quote. And so what that basically means is like the bourgeois, it has so much power, it seems its power and position seems natural, and so its ideas become sort of the ruling ideas. Marx said that very famous quote: "The ruling ideas of every society are those of the rulers." And through
Mm,
this, it wins the consent of the masses for it to rule over the masses, and it has to give up a little bit of something usually in order to do this. I mean, in America, it was the conception of civil liberties, right? Freedom, justice, equality for all. In other societies, it was different things, but they did have to win over some kind of ideological consent because the ruling classes can never do revolution alone. They're always a minority.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, consent, and coercion are, I mean, really big topics that he talks about a lot, and it's tough because he wrote so much and he had so many thoughts. One thing we didn't talk about as much was his view that the petty bourgeoisie had a big role in fascism, and actually a lot of liberal. I was reading a lot of like Robert Paxton, who's a liberal, expert on fascism, and he really concurs with a lot of Gramsci's understanding of fascism as as essentially like guard dogs for the ruling class, to suppress strikes and so on, and that fascism started as this working class movement in Italy, but became thugs for hire by the large landowners in the Po River Valley in Italy, and he talks about this in a good amount of detail in ways that are very interesting and insightful. So he really had a wealth of ideas and insights that extend beyond just cultural hegemony. And he's a very inspiring humanist, and intellectual in general. And I do think there are also non-Marxists who have a lot of respect for him and don't actually bastardize his ideas and still regard him as a Marxist, if they're just intellectually honest. But he's, I think that speaks to his the fact that it's worthwhile to engage with a lot of his thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, and, I mean, Gramsci's and his relationship with Mussolini is interesting because when Mussolini and Gramsci were both part of the PSI, sometimes Mussolini would write articles and Gramsci would somewhat agree with him, right? So and
Mhm.
then very quickly, Mussolini becomes this figure that's rising within Italy, and Gramsci is able to see that fascism and Mussolini's base is really with the petty bourgeois, like small business owners, small landowners. That's really the main force of his base. These people who are afraid of losing their titles, as
Mhm.
first of all, capitalism evolves and takes away, but also things like that. The petty bourgeois, the small business owners, they're always being crushed by bigger business.
Mhm.
And so I it was a really odd time. I think really his analysis is great because especially focusing on fascism's base as the petty bourgeois, because a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol in America on January 6th, we sort of have this idea of them being like these bumpkins, these poor people, these country people who were just like white workers living out of an RV. But a lot of
Mhm.
them were middle class professionals. A lot of them were small business owners. The vast majority of them were. And they were
Mhm.
sort of just more motivated by like great replacement theory and things like that. And so the petty bourgeois, especially since small business owners have such a tenuous relationship in capitalism where they're always on the verge of either becoming successful business owners, and if they become successful, they become big bourgeois, right? Their businesses expand and they become global and, national, whatever. Or
Mhm.
the worst thing where it comes to worst, they're like, they're going to become workers again. Their small business goes under because they're in
Mhm.
such a tenuous spot in capitalism. They need fascism as sort of a self defense mechanism, especially. They're more attracted to fascism than even the bourgeoisie. I mean, the big
Mhm.
industrialists of Germany and Italy were somewhat hesitant about the rise of Mussolini and Hitler. I mean, of course, eventually they gave in, but was really their big organic force that got them up there was their small business owner classes.
Yeah. And I think today that's even more true because there really is a aversion to fascism amongst the bourgeoisie, amongst the big bourgeoisie in America because they've seen how, horrifically destructive it is. There really is like you need to be in a really desperate situation as a capitalist to be interested in that kind of thing because it's so unpredictable and so um, you know people like oftentimes in the left fascism is viewed as just kind of a plot by the bourgeoisie, kind of this tricky plot. And of course, that ultimately ends up being the case because they make a deal. The leadership makes a deal that they're gonna crush the communists and so on and so forth. Um, but it also starts off as like a legitimate organic movement. And I think there is a component of, I don't want to say human nature, but certainly this like, fear of the other, everyone's out to get you. You need to be proud of your country, and this like romantic idea of the hero's journey, and conquering, and that legitimately does appeal to people, like even out, and appeals to a lot of working class people too. And it's really, I think, part of this like darker, more kind of fear-oriented mode that a lot of people think in. And it does kind of start off as a natural thing, that people fall for because they become convinced like everyone hates me, everyone's out to get me, there's danger, like everything's falling apart, and of course there is a real affinity for violence amongst human beings. It's not just uh a product of advanced industrial society, unfortunately. And so it is really concerning because the bourgeoisie, I think at this point, and back then they were probably more naive, but at this point, I think they're thinking if there's a real communist revolution, we'll go with these guys again. But I think even a guy like Trump, who you could say is on the fascist spectrum, but certainly isn't a Mussolini or a Hitler. Um, Even a guy like that is seems to be really concerning them, because he's bad for business. It's all this instability. He's really stupid also,
Yeah.
which doesn't help. And so, really, the petty bourgeoisie is the class that's really desperate. And it's like whatever, because they are in a much more precarious position. Um, it's more likely that like a big capitalist will figure, I can figure this out somehow, go to another country, whatever. But the petite bourgeoisie are going to be much more desperate, um, and much more ardently supportive of fascism. I think you really see this in Israel as well, and of course the whole society in Israel is, really arguably fascist. I mean, I would say so, and I think you would too. But the small business owners in Israel, are like a cut above the rest, really. So you can see there's a real affinity there.
Yeah, and I think, like, part of Trump's tariffs even are sort of like a misguided attempt at, like, appealing to his petty bourgeois base. I mean, really, what is it about? It's about building back up American industries and building back up
Mm.
manufacturing, and I don't know. These are like, and this fight against China, I mean, this is really just stuff that appeals to, like, small pop mom and pop shop owners. I mean, especially who've
Mm.
been especially destroyed in the era of globalization. LMAO, lol, you're this.
Did you see people were joking that it was like a really lame version of secession? Um,
No, I haven't seen that.
but yeah, I mean, Elon Musk and Trump have been arguing a lot about the tariffs. And there's like pictures that are really funny in the White House of like Donald Trump pointing in Elon Musk's face and like them arguing. And it makes total sense because Elon Musk is like, look, you know, capital is global. Like there's Elon Musk is a great example too, because by all, if you just look at his Twitter and the great replacement theory and all that, like, the salute, I mean, you'd say this guy's a fascist, no question. But when it comes down to it, really, he's not this like committed ultra nationalist. He's interested in using it as a tool. Um, Whereas Trump is like, "Oh, no, I'm actually gonna do this for all these, like, idiots to make them feel like they, are getting something." And then, all of the capitalists are like, "You're crazy." And I think he's really putting himself in, like, at serious risk. I mean, I don't doubt that there are lots of very powerful people who, would like to have him dead for sure.
Oh, he's gonna get himself JFK'd, absolutely. I feel like,
Yeah.
I mean, like, he's kind of asking for it these days. Um,
Which would probably be bad because he'd turn into a martyr, but,
mm,
yeah.
uh, funny bad, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. The world stage has been a little bit of a comedy show, and I've been indulging in it. I'm not gonna lie. Like, even though
That's
we're
true.
fucked, you know, even though we're fucked.
I was going to say though, I guess we've kind of naturally gotten into a modern conversation, but it was interesting the whole like Hassan Piker argument that happened sort of recently about, is there this left-wing pipeline? Is Hassan like a social democrat that, changes a lot of people's minds? And then there's people who have said, well, it's not really true. He kind of gets people into a rut. He gets them into a place where they are closed-minded to the left. Um, and then of course, anecdotally, like I'm sure there's a lot of people that used to watch Hassan and now like are really into Bad Empanada or something, and their views have changed, as they've been exposed to more and more left ideas. But it's sort of an interesting question, like, is this sort of the attitude we should take to spreading like counter hegemonic ideas online, or you know what should be done there? There's certainly more of a demand. It's remarkable that there's anyone at all on the left doing that online, given how much money like these operations like the Daily Wire get. But so that it also shows there is a real like organic demand as well. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's odd. I cannot deny that, I mean, there are left-wing and right-wing pipelines online, and the right-wing one is a lot stronger, right? Like, we were talking about it earlier, like the Gold, for example, these sort of traditional intellectuals that act like they're apolitical and they're not doing anything. And, you get these impressionable young teenagers going from Halo to Hitler all the time. And this exists in a variety of videos. Like you can watch working out videos, and even like gym culture within America has like a very right wing leaning, and it very quickly gets these young impressionable boys into a right wing pipeline. And I cannot deny. I mean, I think it's very hard to deny that Hassan Piker has not positively impacted a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people have become communists because of Hassan, even if he himself doesn't present himself as a communist. And he presents himself as like a very palatable social democrat. A lot of people have become a communist or an anarchist because of Hassan. He de-scarifies a lot of these ideas. In a very digestible way for somebody who's slightly more to the left of Democrats, right? Like that's Hassan's utility, and that's like a lot of these like creators' utility. But I think where I sort of have issues is like this idea that as communists have to hide our ideas, right? Like as communists have to make ourselves more palatable to the
Mhm.
American working class and sort of de-radicalize what we're saying. And, obviously the way you say it is important. I mean, if you run down the street right now, like butt naked, yelling out, Stalin did nothing wrong, Stalin did nothing wrong, like that's not winning over anybody, right? But
Yeah.
if, if we are essentially lying to people, right, and saying, and we're not mentioning like the vanguard, right, the political vanguard, the inevitability of revolution, the violent struggle, right, and of course, like we can say it in nicer ways. I mean, than I'm saying right now. If we don't get these ideas out there, eh, what happens is people just end up being social democrats, right? Like if we
Mhm.
palatable our ideas so much that they lose their original attention, they become unfocused, they become so spread out that people sort of just fall back into the Democratic Party pipeline, really. And
Mhm.
the most left they ever go is Democrat. And in addition to that, I don't think communists should be afraid to be open, to be radical, to say their ideas. Um, what really I think needs to be said is that Hassan is only as good as long as we can critique his limitations, right?
Mhm.
When we are allowed to critique Hassan's limitations, and Hassanabi, please come onto the pod. I love you. When we're able to critique how far Hassan goes through his sort of social democratic framework, and I don't believe he's
Mhm.
social democratic either. I mean, honestly, I think he's a little bit more radical than that, though he hides his
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
power level. But like for example, the interview with Bernie Sanders and AOC, when impressionable young Hanasabi fans saw people criticizing Hassan's interview with AOC and Bernie Sanders from the left and not from the right, when they saw
Mhm.
somebody saying like, "Oh, Bernie Sanders is a social imperialist. Bernie Sanders killed Rosa. Bernie Sanders fails the people of Gaza, or AOC fails the people of Gaza. It
Mhm.
doesn't have international solidarity. For the first time within these young men's minds, it gets their heads turning. It makes them think past social democracy as a framework. It makes them think past Democratic Party politics as a framework.
Mhm.
And we need ruthless, I mean, Leninism was originally conceived as ruthless criticism of all Marxist movements. We need ruthless criticism to get the correct party line. And so the left pipeline does exist. I think Hasanabi is immensely useful. Like so many young men became radicalized because of him, but he's only useful if we can criticize his failures, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I really agree with that. I think it's yeah, and I think like the thing that really makes him stick out, I think, um, is ultimately that he never punches left. It's kind of like the meme, like when Gen Z drags me on the street for being, not far left enough or whatever. But he definitely, even when like Bad and Banana made a bunch of videos about him and everyone was bugging him, like he responded to the Bad and Banana video, I think, um, and he just kind of brushed it aside. He was kind of like he didn't say nothing, but he certainly wasn't like, oh, well, that guy, he's just so far left. He's just so out there. He's so crazy and radical. Like he never says something like that, except to say something along the lines of like, well, if you're a Maoist or whatever, like you can't just talk to people this way. You have to like defend. He thinks there's a strategic issue. Like he never will say like, oh, well, they're crazy far left. And I think that is really great because it would definitely be a dead end if he was like, no, 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 no. Like my ideology is right and like I'm right here. And if you go this way or that way, you're wrong. He does seem to think of himself as somebody that just drags everything as far left as he possibly can while maintaining like this, presence and these relationships with people, which is definitely a lot better than, I mean, like even I may not say Kyle, from the Young Turks, but definitely like David Pakman. I mean, like no, quite, like David. No one's getting farther left than David Pakman because he'll shit on the right or on the left all day. Um, you know, whereas Hassan doesn't seem to really do that, and that does seem like an interesting like difference that can help help him be more effective.
Yeah, I mean, I even think Kyle Kalinske is somewhat useful because like David Pakman, when you get stuck in the David Pakman left pipeline, he stops at anything past even Bernie Sanders, and even sometimes he's like a little bit more to the right of Bernie Sanders, like
Mm,
honestly. But like Hassan, yeah, I don't see like Hassan and Vosh are two completely different things. Like if you look at them, the Vosh left pipeline completely stops at tankies and starts at NATO, right? Like
mhm,
when you're deprogramming yourself, and you're a Western kid, and you've been believing in, I don't know, whatever bullshit, like taxes. Oh, for whatever reason, American politics are based off of taxes. I don't know why. Like that's our framework. I think it's because of like how our nation was founded off of tax evasion, basically. But uh, y-
yeah.
when you're like slowly deconstructing yourself, it's like, oh, maybe the Democrats aren't so good, blah, 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 blah. But then when you get into the Vosh pipeline, you're unable to deconstruct yourself from NATO. You're unable to deconstruct yourself from Democratic Party politics. He fundamentally keeps you stuck in there. And then he says, tankies, 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 tankies. To him,
Mhm,
the tankies are the worst thing ever. And so you get trapped from there's a glass ceiling from radical Marxist thought that will actually fundamentally overthrow Western society.
mhm.
It's really doing the work of the CIA or FBI. Hassan
Yeah.
doesn't do that. He'll platform
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard him say tanky.
no, except for like a joke or something, maybe. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
but
Yeah.
Hassan,
Yeah, just,
no, go ahead.
yeah, but it is interesting, yeah, because I think, like, he would probably be the first to say, like, he's not the smartest, like, advocate of Marxist theory. He's not, like, the mo but it is an interesting question of, like, how and also, like, the question of, like, inertia, like, when it comes to moving from a hegemonic way of looking at things and a counter hegemonic way of looking at things. Like, what's what's the physics of that process? Like, you could say on the internet, like, well, you find this person that's saying this that's interesting, and you find this person that's saying this that's interesting, and you kind of get, plopped around based on what you engage with, and you kind of have this intellectual development. But then sometimes, you might go in one direction and then go into another, or you might change your mind. It's interesting, and it seems like very topical and important to understand how that works, how that process takes place, um, and what the physics are behind it, because that should probably tell us a lot about what the most effective, left wing streaming or whatever de-radicalization techniques are.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, I mean, I think it brings up questions like, would a stagist sort of view of a deconstruction of somebody from like bourgeois ideology to communism be deterministic in some way? Like if we were to say like the stages that people go through usually is like, I don't know, like Democratic Party supporter, like liberal, and then like they're like a little bit progressive, and then sock dem, and then dem sock, and then like anarchist, Marxist Leninist, and then the true ideology, Gonzalo thought,
Yeah, yeah.
and then after that, Pol Pot thought,
Yeah, yeah.
the ultimate. But
That's correct. This podcast endorses Pol Pot, by the way.
absolutely, absolutely, he did nothing wrong. Khmer Rouge all the way. Um,
Yeah.
but if we envision it as like a stagist sort of, does that sort of fall into everything that Gramsci was trying to avoid, you think? Or is it sort of natural and a good, accurate prescription?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think Gramsci was more interested in like how um the specific stages that were thought of, were wrong. But not I don't know that you could say he didn't think history progressed through stages. Like, I think he just thought that there was like a certain turbulence and complexity that wasn't understood. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's this um yeah, there's all this complicated interaction between the superstructure and the base that makes this very linear view. Because I think also Marxism develops like under the specter of the French Revolution, and the development of the French Third and Fourth Republics, because the French Revolution was really a moment where this new formation, this new economic structure made the existing political system, uncapable, really just like broken, and resulted in this hugely violent and massive overthrow of society that ultimately did turn into real changes in the institutions, and institutions that still exist in France today. And it was all a result of the economic transformations and the urbanization and so on and so forth. And I think that for a lot of 19th century theorists, it was really easy to see history as a sequence of French Revolution style events where the economy and the base changes and the political system changes um, thereafter. But Gramsci, I think, understood that feudalism lasted for forever and ever, lasted for a really long time. You know, you could still say 1,000 years ago, like you could conclude 1,000 years ago in, any given country that, yeah, this feudal system's gonna go because the peasants resent the feudal lords, they resent the ground rent, you know, sometimes they revolt, they're pissed off, they don't like this. Eventually, something else will take its place. And, then if another 200 years of history passed, it might look like you're kind of ridiculous because it would still be there almost unchanged until the French Revolution. So I think, and of course, then you have all these complex techniques that, kept feudalism going, the very like nuanced, like set of social relations that kept feudalism going. And so I think Gramsci more just tried to develop like how capitalism as a organization of society will, grow and evolve in ways that the 18th century Marxists didn't see because, or the 19th century, excuse me, because it also just nominal, like normatively, like, yeah, I mean, if the big change was in 1800, and the development of liberal democracy, that was like the big change. Um, is it reasonable to think that like 100 years later, the next big change is going to happen? Like, it's a big assumption. That's pretty fast, and it's pretty reasonable to think that the system will develop, in all kinds of ways before its inevitable collapse. So I think there's room for Gramsci in being a determinist, but he was also someone who was just very thoughtful and thought a lot about what he didn't know and what he didn't understand, and what else might be going on that complicates this picture.
Yeah, and even in the case of bourgeois revolution, I mean, Marxists often conceptualize it very mechanically, like, as it happening as like a streamlined process. When your bourgeois revolution, like as it happened across Europe and the world, and that transitionary phase to feudalism, it was very uneven. It was very messy. There was big gains and drawbacks. Even within France itself, the French Revolution, what it went from like a very radical revolution back to into some sort of pseudo monarchism with
Mhm.
Napoleon. Um, and so, I think Gramsci's great realization was, and, I mean, nobody can say that Gramsci didn't believe that revolution wasn't going to happen, but that, I think his great realization was to stop looking at the base and superstructure so mechanically that, you know, revolution will inevitably happen without any human action, without any
Mhm.
human interaction, without any human motivation. And Gramsci's great realization was that no, a lot of Marxists have been sort of completely relying on, Marxist idea that man is a culmination of a social being, like the society around him, but man also makes history. It's not like an idealist liberal view of history, but you have to give more pertinence to man in changing history. Um, and that's
Yeah, and,
really where
and if
it's
you,
yeah, go ahead, Henry.
I was just gonna say, have to go momentarily, but I was going to say, and if you think about the French Revolution, there was so much work that was done, by so many people to create parallel institutions and a different kind of republican civil society, before the actual revolution took place. It took a lot of work. It wasn't just this thing that happened.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just like you can't sit around and let the contradictions of capitalism happen and let you have to actively participate in it. And it should be also a cultural struggle where you create a counter hegemony, you create like a working class consciousness. Rounding up our conversation about like the left pipeline, yeah, I mean, I think the general evolution that most people have is like, liberal, suck, damn, anarchist, Marxist Leninist, Maoist, or, they stay Marxist Leninist. But, we also need to maintain a little bit of flexibility and ability to get out communist ideals and critiques of people like Hassan and Bernie Sanders and AOC. We have to be honest about our ideals. Otherwise, we sort of fall into too of a mechanical view of how people evolve. Like some
Mhm.
people can genuinely jump in that timeline, or some people don't even go through that timeline. They go through a completely different political evolution, and we can't fall into this sort of very mechanical thinking of the evolution of people. And
Mhm.
that means also criticizing Hassan when he does something a little bit too liberal, like, I don't know, interviewing Bernie Sanders and AOC, though there were nuances to that conversation where, like, he criticized them afterwards and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like you said, it is great because it sparks, conversation, and yeah, the only way that there would be a pipeline is if there was some sort of struggle session style discourse, and the other interesting thing is like we're not really talking about like these people as much as we are like an imaginary person viewing them, um, which is kind of an interesting perspective as well. And that definitely has a lot of nuances there. But yeah, I think to sort of conclude on my end, though, I think there definitely are a lot of nuances and Marxist criticisms of Gramsci as well. I think and a lot of ideas that he had that we didn't really get to today. But what's always, I think, really inspired me about Gramsci is really just his sheer intellect, and his curiosity. He wrote tons and tons about like Italian myths and literature and philosophy, and was really just a extremely curious, very intellectual person. And a lot of that, there's something to be said for having that kind of attitude as well. That it's really important to, always maintain, um, or spread as much as possible. Just an intellectual attitude towards things. Not in the sense of like a academic attitude, but just like being interested in history and learning about economics and politics. And that's something anyone can do. And, especially now, people waste a lot of time, on their phone, like doing dumb stuff. We all do it. And there's, a lot that's lost there in terms of like attention span, in terms of what people know, what people are thinking about. And I really do think that it might not be inevitable, but it's probably likely that the more people think intellectually and really consider a lot of these questions, the more proletarian consciousness is likely to emerge.
Yeah, I think what inspires me so much about Gramsci is that he believed that everybody could be an intellectual. Like there's an intellectual within everybody. He had a very big belief in the masses. And I think in the internet age, especially if you have a phone and you have a little bit of Marxist knowledge, we need organic intellectuals. Like you need to become a content creator. You need to, or post something, or a blogger, or a writer, or something. You need to spread, if you have the ability, do you need to spread organic ideas, you to the proletariat. You have to get a proletariat common sense started. You have to create a counter hegemony. You have to get people out of their consent with the current
Mhm.
state, especially because we've got an uphill battle. I mean, man, like Daily Wire gets millions of dollars, PragerU gets millions of dollars, TPUSA gets millions of dollars. But
Mhm.
what we do have on our side is that our theories are correct, right? Like we have a scientific Marxist outlook, and rather than idealism, rather than this bullshit about identity or like trans bathrooms being why people are poor.
Or
Or
abundance.
yeah, some stupid ass, I don't know, like fucking
Yeah.
recently they're like on some like struggle between like a teenager killed another teenager, but because that teenager's black, it's like the biggest thing in the world, and the right is just freaking out the fuck about it. It's like, how the fuck does that help you feed your family? Like on God, like really, like eh,
Yeah.
they focus on the stupidest cultural battles, but
Mhm.
we're right that our suffering is based in class struggle. We have the correct theory that our suffering is rooted in class struggle, and the way to overcome it is through the vanguard party. But we need to get those ideas out there. And so, if you're listening to this and you have even the most basic Marxist knowledge, I highly recommend just starting something, to get.
Yeah. And there's also an aspect in which a lot is actually in our favor, because one of the interesting self-destructive mechanisms of capitalism is that there's this fetishization of revolution, in media, in, like shows like The White Lotus, which satirizes, bourgeois society, or Severance, or The Hunger Games, which is all about it's kind of revolutionary heroism. And people love that kind of thing. People are, really get into it as a type of media. And I think that, that's also a way that in capitalist society, people can kind of let off their energies and frustration with their alienation and exploitation. But it also creates a legitimate affinity for subversive ideas. This idea that, I have this view of the world that's really different and kind of scary to people. And, it becomes something people are interested in. And as it seems like the world is about to become significantly more unstable. As people start getting kind of freaked out by that, they're going to gravitate towards subversive ideas like that. So there's a lot of headwind, but there's also a lot of tailwind, and a lot of time for this uh, process to play itself out.
Absolutely, absolutely, and honestly, we really do have the scientific theory on our side, and what I think we really have on our side is that everybody knows that we can't keep on going on like this anymore. Like, really, like capitalism, like everybody has to admit that, even
Mhm.
the most right wing reactionaries. And PragerU and TPUSA and like these like bourgeois, hegemonic, I don't know, like these organic intellectuals of the bourgeois, they really try to sort of toe this line that neoliberalism has to stay, and it's sort of a losing battle every single day. Like as more days pass, our neoliberal way of doing capitalism becomes untenable for even fascists and the right wing and liberals, and every single political ideology is now starting to recognize that we really can't do this any longer, like the way we've been doing capitalism as it is.
Mhm.
Yeah.
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 Er,
Well,
huh.
Henry, this has been a fun conversation. Shame that we couldn't go over all his ideas, but he's got a lot of ideas. Gramsci, great guy. Um,
He did.
what did you read specifically in order to prepare for this? And do you have any final words?
I think just I mean, I have read the prison notebooks, or the editions I have. But there was actually a quote, and I'd recommend going over them. There's some great lectures on YouTube also though, that talk a lot about his ideas. But I think one of the most like impressive like examples of like how prescient he was is this quote in Notebook 2 where he talks about the Eurasian movement, and basically talked about how in Russia there's this ideology that Russia is more Asiatic. Those are his words. Than it's not part of Europe, and that there's this authoritarian tendency in this movement that likes the Bolsheviks but would rather that they be nationalist. And it's pretty remarkable just how, he also identifies like Orthodox Christianity. And it's pretty remarkable how you could apply all of that really to the modern day Russian Federation, and people like Alexander Dugin. Um, and, the fact that he wrote that 100 years ago and had that kind of insight into um, that strain in Russian politics, I think is really impressive. And it's a testament to just how many gems there are in his thought. And, it's like 3,000 pages in his total notebooks. So, it's not exactly the best use of your time to go through all of it unless you really want to get into him. But there's a lot you can read, and just pick out of it. And, odds are it'll be quite interesting and stick with you. So
Yeah.
that would be my kind of last message.
Yeah, of course. I utilized selections of prison notebooks published by Jacobin, I believe, or at least they're associated with Jacobin, and then Hegemony and Revolution, Tony Gramsci's Political Theory by Walter L. Addison. And yeah, this was a lot of fun. Gramsci's theories are so interesting, man. I honestly think that he fixed a lot of issues that mechanical, sort of like even Marxist Leninism fell into, like mechanically,
Mhm.
things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely believe
And it's
it.
always good to like have this reminder that like even though there is this Marxist understanding that is true in terms of class struggle and the need for a revolution and so on and so forth, like it's important to, I think, really have that attitude of asking questions and discussing things and not being like dogmatic within certain boundaries and, all of that, because it can really advance, um, and and generate a lot of really useful and great ideas for people.
Yep, yep. Gramsci is the seventh head of Marxism next to Pol Pot. Before we go, I would like to add one more thing without Henry here. So this is not Henry approved, though honestly, he would agree with me. One point that I really wanted to bring up was a really good way to highlight the difference between civil society and the state. And I think within the American context, a really easy way to visualize this is that Biden ruled more through a civil society and Trump rules more through the repressive state. And what I mean by that is that it's not that Biden didn't arrest protesters and things like that. But Biden's reign as president mostly relied on media apparatuses, the traditional superstructure such as education, culture, Hollywood, in order to get his consent from the masses to rule. And then, of course, the issue of liberation of Palestine came up, and the horrible genocide that was being committed by Israel and America against the Palestinian people. And so, slowly but surely, the American bourgeois could no longer rule with simply civil society, right? They could no longer rule through the consent of the masses because their lie had essentially been revealed. It became an indefensible position. America's foreign policy in Israel and Palestine, and even to some extent, America's system itself, capitalism. And so now, what we're seeing with the Trump administration is more so rule through the state. It's shifted to the state because it can no longer keep a lot of groups within the civil society, within consent and the hegemony. Because of this counter hegemony growing, Donald Trump has been forced to arrest Palestinian student protesters, forced to arrest immigration activists, and so we've really seen Trump employ the state as a final self defense mechanism when civil society is no longer good enough for the American bourgeois to rule. Um, this is all to say that our goal in creating the counter hegemony is to push society, and so much that they're forced to repress us. And to some extent, I think that what's happening right now is a good sign, as much as, obviously arresting people is bad, but it is a good sign in that they're scared at the top right now. Look, we only have freedom of speech for so long. We only have these liberties for so long that we've been allowed to do, uh, which allow us to organize. And we've never really truly had freedom of speech or any of the civil liberties given by America. But as long as we have the ability to organize the proletariat freely, let's keep on using these abilities until they take them away, the bourgeois. Like, let's force the bourgeois to take them away, um, through creating counter hegemonies, through activism, through economic struggle. Let's use freedom of speech until the bourgeois is forced to take it away. Let's give them an actual communist threat to be afraid of. Because right now they're cracking down on a non existent communist threat. Really. Let's give them a real communist threat to be afraid of. And of course, you cannot rely on state repression forever. The Tsar learned that very quickly. The Tsar would arrest Russian revolutionaries like Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin. He would exile them, but he was only able to do it for a month or so, for a year or so, a couple years or so. And eventually it became so many revolutionaries to lock up that, you can't really lock up as many. And you keep on trying to, it's sort of like procrastinating on a contradiction, right? This organic intellectual that is helming this upcoming class, and you can jail them for a year or two and, sort of throw away the key and hope that the contradiction that they represent will go away. But eventually it doesn't. So as much as it is horrific right now, there's a little bit of optimism I have in what's happening. In that the bourgeois are scared. We are giving them a threat to be scared of. Let's make that threat even bigger. All right. Thank you, comrades. You have a good one.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made it.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.